When an angry mob surrounds a house, a simple wooden door won't last more than a few minutes. On the night before the annihilation of Sodom, the target was Lot's residence. Hundreds of men pounded on the entrance with the sole objective of violating the guests and slaughtering the family. The hinges were already giving way under brute force. A rescue seemed mathematically impossible. But in the millisecond the wood was about to splinter, the group was not struck by lightning. They were hit by a silent, invisible, and surgical strike. In the blink of an eye, dozens of attackers simply forgot where the door was. It wasn't ordinary darkness. It was a severe collective mental blackout. By crossing modern neurological reports with original Hebrew manuscripts, we will dissect the attack at Lot's door, a forensic analysis of the weapon that short-circuited the most lethal mob of antiquity, neutralizing the siege without spilling a single drop of blood. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah has been told to exhaustion through the lens of the fire and brimstone that wiped out the plain the following morning. The human mind clings to the spectacle of destruction, ignoring the claustrophobic suspense that preceded it. But this classic narrative overshadows a disturbing detail. The real terror, the scenario of raw survival, did not happen in the light of day. It happened the night before, in the dark, behind closed doors. When the two beings crossed the city gates, our historical perception needs to be adjusted. They arrived discreetly, but they weren't missionaries seeking converts nor celestial diplomats. Reading the original text with the coldness of a military analysis, we see they operated exactly like a tactical extraction team. They had a clear target and mission with no margin for error: locate Lot, isolate him from the threat, and get him out of the urban perimeter before the imminent detonation. The clock was already counting down to ashes. The plan was surgical, but the infiltration was brutally compromised. The silent rescue in the shadows turned into a suffocating nightmare. The whole city noticed the movement. Sodom operated like a living, hungry organism, and its territorial, predatory instinct spoke louder. Within hours, the team and the target were completely cornered inside the house. What the Hebrew texts describe is not a disorganized riot. This is the exact anatomy of a military siege and an intervention under indescribable psychological pressure. To understand the gravity of that night, we must dive into the collective mind of the crowd outside and analyze the predatory psychology that governed the city. It was a sick society, where violence and physical dominance over foreigners was an implicit social policy, a twisted form of power. The air around the house was thick with tension. The wooden door was the only physical barrier between sanity and an absolute massacre. The focus of our investigation isn't just the savagery, but the relentless defensive response against it. We will decode the rare physiological phenomenon described in the original text. The intervention that saved Lot didn't use swords or artillery. It was a cognitive collapse so specific, a short circuit so lethal and silent in the minds of the attackers, that modern medicine is intrigued. What occurred was an acute dysfunction in visual processing, a crash in the central nervous system. To this day, neurologists try to understand how this supernatural attack deactivated the human brain so surgically, neutralizing the mob without spilling a drop of blood. Before we open these files for our forensic analysis, leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment your name and age down below. It's crucial for us to know who is joining us on this deep journey in search of the true story. To understand the gravity of that night, we need to sweep from our minds any romanticized vision, like those harmless classical paintings. The Hebrew account in Genesis chapter 19 brings a detail that usually goes unnoticed in a quick read, but which is the true moral death certificate of that society. The text says, with chilling clarity, that the men of the city surrounded the house, and makes a point to record, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. Pay attention to this. We're not talking about an isolated street gang, a shadow militia, or half a dozen troublemakers on the sidewalk. It was the entire demographic base. What kind of collective sociopathy drags everyone from a growing teenager to an elderly man into the street in the middle of the night with a single sadistic goal? This shows us plainly that violence in Sodom wasn't the exception. It was the rule, the unwritten law, the local sport. In the ancient Middle East, the law of hospitality was a non-negotiable foundation. The outsider was protected by a deep code of honor, respected even by the roughest desert tribes. Offering shelter, bread, and security to a traveler was almost a religious and diplomatic duty. But Sodom took that moral compass and smashed it against the wall. If we cross the biblical accounts with the sociology and customs of neighboring peoples, it becomes clear that the crowd's intention in trying to violate the strangers wasn't motivated by a simple quest for unbridled carnal pleasure. The issue runs much deeper. Gang rape of outsiders in that brutal context functioned as an urban terrorism tactic. It was a tool of territorial domination and absolute humiliation. In plain terms, it was the city's perverse way of marking its territory and sending a very clear message to anyone who dared enter without bowing their head. They wanted to break the backbone of the visitor's dignity, reducing those men to the status of hunted prey. It's a prison mentality, vilely applied to the geopolitics of the era. Inside the house, the oxygen seemed to be vanishing. Lot's residence wasn't a bank vault. Buildings in that region in Canaan and the Jordan Plain were built with interlocking stones and mud, sporting sturdy wooden doors. True, but they were never designed to withstand the impact of hundreds of bodies acting like a human battering ram. The panic inside that room had to be contained at all costs so it wouldn't turn into hysteria. With the coldness of a cinema camera positioned in the room, we see Lot's wife and daughters cornered in a dark corner, listening to the muffled insults outside. The sound of chaotic footsteps, punches on the masonry, the murmur that gradually thickens and turns into a deafening roar of a mob thirsty for domination. The attackers' torches illuminating the cracks in the wood and projecting deformed shadows on the ceiling. The heavy breathing of someone who knows they've fallen into a lethal trap. The narrative tension here is purely claustrophobic. Lot is, literally, with his back pressed against the door, feeling in his shoulder blades the vibration of every pound, every kick, every shoulder charge the crowd delivers from outside. The fury of the locals reaches a boiling point. The tragedy takes shape through the total lack of an exit. There was no way to call the authorities, ask for backup, or cry for justice simply because the law, the judges, and the so-called good citizens of Sodom were all out there, demanding a massacre. The collective predator was in absolute control of the block. Mass psychology masterfully explains what was happening on that street. When an individual joins a mob, they completely lose the brakes of individuality. The guy who, alone, might not have the courage to lay a hand on his neighbor, feels invincible, invisible, and unpunished in the middle of the crowd. Personal responsibility vanishes. It's the herd mentality operating at its highest degree of toxicity. They barked insults, pounded with blind fury, and threatened to rip off the roof and the hinges if the victims weren't handed over on a silver platter. It is in this abyss of pressure that the inevitability of the invasion crushes any hope. Collapse was seconds away. A wooden barrier has an insurmountable mechanical and physical limit. The planks begin to bow. The nails and the thick latch groan under the extreme stress of continuous pressure. Every hit shakes dry dust from the ceiling onto Lot's shoulders. He is no longer calculating if they'll get in. He knows the defense will break. It's just a cruel and silent matter of the stopwatch. Human instinct screams that there is no escape route. The veneer of civilization had melted into the gutter. That crowd proved definitively that when the moral structure of a people rots completely, empathy dies, and there is no human force capable of stopping the monster that awakens in the dark. The claustrophobia reaches a breaking point so severe that rationality simply melts away. It is in this scenario of absolute panic, with adrenaline intoxicating the brain, that one of the most bizarre, hard-to-swallow, and disturbing episodes of the biblical narrative occurs. Pressed against the wall, listening to the guttural roar of a crowd thirsty for violence, Lot makes a decision that causes immediate repulsion and confusion. In an act of unthinkable desperation, he cracks the door open, places his body as a physical shield between the mob and his house, and attempts a macabre negotiation. He offers his 2 virgin daughters for those men to do with as they please, pathetically begging them to spare the integrity of his guests. Let's be very direct. Our role is not to sugarcoat Lot's attitude, nor to justify the unjustifiable with superficial theological excuses. For our moral compass and basic protective instinct, his action is a monstrous human failure, indefensible cowardice, and an unacceptable betrayal. But in a forensic analysis of the environment, we must dissect the dark psychology of the scene. Lot was operating in the most instinctive survival mode, on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The weight of the law of hospitality in the ancient Middle East was so overwhelming and viscerally rooted that the host considered the guest's life infinitely more sacred than his own family. More than that, this sickening offer exposes the level of radioactive contamination in Sodom. Lot was considered righteous, but living for years on end immersed in the city's moral sewer and inversion of values twisted his mind. The madness of the environment rotted his sense of proportion. It is the ultimate proof that you can't live on the edge of the abyss without the abyss eventually taking up residence inside you. What happens in the following seconds unmasks the diabolical nature of the siege and delivers the city's definitive diagnosis. The mob, foaming with rage, rejects the offer. Think of the mathematical coldness of this. If those men's goal was just to satisfy a primitive carnal desire of nocturnal predators, they would have accepted the girls and the matter would be closed. However, they don't back down a single millimeter. The mob's unyielding refusal proves that the central issue was never organic pleasure. It was a pure, raw, and unquestionable exercise of power. It was laser-focused predation. That group allowed no distractions or consolation prizes. They wanted to subjugate the unknown, break the backbone of the visitor's dignity, and prove through punitive rape that in Sodom The outsider has no voice. They wanted to dominate celestial beings with brute force, reducing them to trophies of their barbarism. When Lot insists on arguing, the negotiation collapses. The little patience the mob feigned evaporates. The hatred changes direction and targets the host. The Hebrew text recounts the furious cry, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he keeps acting as a judge." It is the classic and lethal militia mentality. From that millisecond on, diplomacy dies and gives way to raw, naked physical aggression. Lot instantly ceases to be the tolerated resident and becomes the enemy. The violent shoving begins. Multiple arms reach out in the dark, trying to grab Lot's clothes, tearing the fabric in an attempt to drag him out into the street, where he would be summarily lynched. It is exactly at this point that the breach occurs. The kinetic force applied against the structure reaches critical mass. The thick wood of the door groans and cracks under the unbearable pressure. The wrought iron hinges begin to visibly bend, sending sharp splinters flying in all directions. Dust falls from the stone ceiling onto the heads of those inside, while hundreds of shoulders and feet batter the entrance in a frantic rhythm. The protective barrier sways, held up by a miracle of rudimentary engineering, and it becomes obvious that the door won't withstand more than one or two more impacts. Absolute chaos is breaking through the barriers to invade the room. It's the end of the line for any human resistance. To deeply understand how episodes like Sodom fit into the timeline and shaped history, you need a panoramic view of the landscape. That's why I invite you to check out our exclusive ebook, The Bible in Chronological Order, from Genesis to Revelation. The link is pinned right down below in the first comment. It is an essential map for anyone who wants to stop being a casual reader and transform into an investigator of sacred texts. Returning to our night, as the door gives way to the weight of the crowd, the emergency intervention is about to launch its attack. In the millisecond, the iron hinge gives way and the thick wooden door splinters under the weight of the human battering ram. Chaos seems to have won. The first invader of Sodom is one step away from setting foot in the room with bloodshot eyes fueled by the fury of someone who knows the hunt is over and the massacre is about to begin. Lot, in a state of shock, just waits for the lynching. But it is in this fraction of a second that the power dynamic is flipped upside down. The two supposedly defenseless travelers drop the victim mask and assume absolute control. With a coldness worthy of elite tactical operators, they don't draw conventional weapons, don't scream for help, and don't try to negotiate. They simply pull Lot violently inside and lock whatever is left of the entrance. Since a breached barrier holds back no one, the threat on the street had to be neutralized. And what happens next is one of the most surgical physiological events in antiquity. They fire upon the crowd. There was no explosion, flames raining from the sky, or seismic rumble. The attack was silent, invisible, and laser-focused. In the blink of an eye, the mob that foamed with hatred simply freezes. The coordinated murderous rage gives way to agonizing mental confusion. That sea of people, from teenagers to the elderly, suddenly can no longer take a step in the right direction. They start feeling the air, awkwardly bumping into each other and scratching their hands on the stone walls, completely disoriented. They forgot where the door was. And to understand the monstrous magnitude of this attack, we must abandon our modern reading and open the linguistic and medical autopsy of that night. The traditional biblical text says the men of Sodom were struck with blindness. Our conditioned mind immediately projects a grotesque scene of people with gouged out eyes, stumbling in a pitch-black darkness. But the original Hebrew does not agree with that image. The author uses a very rare word, a term so specific it only appears twice in the vast library of the Bible, sanvorim. Pay attention to this forensic detail. In everyday Hebrew, there is a common word for physical blindness, which is iver. If the crowd had gone blind in an ophthalmological sense, with their vision blacked out or retinas detached, the writer would have recorded iver. But he made sure to hammer down sanvorim. The literal translation points to a dazzling blindness, an acute blinding light, or profound induced mental confusion. The morphology of the word suggests something that doesn't wipe out vision, but overloads it to the limit of what is bearable. Those men's eyes didn't explode in blood. They remained open, wide in the dark, capturing the light of the torches normally. The problem was not in the eyeball. The strike didn't target the men's faces. It directly hit their cerebral cortex. What ancient texts report aligns with mathematical precision to a severe clinical condition that modern medicine classifies as cortical blindness, or visual agnosia. Translating from white coat medical jargon to our everyday life, think of the human eye as a next-generation camera and the brain as the processor that reads those images. In ordinary blindness, the lens breaks and light simply doesn't get in. But in induced cortical blindness, the camera keeps recording in ultra-high definition, yet the cable connecting the lens to the processor suffers a blackout. The occipital lobe collapses. The individual sees, but the mind decodes absolutely nothing. They lose their spatial map. They look at the doorknob inches from their nose, but the brain doesn't process that it's a door. To prove this thesis, just look at the only other passage where sanvorim is cited. In the second book of Kings, chapter 6, the Aramean army attempts to capture the prophet Elisha, suffers an attack of sanvorim, and what happens? Elisha leads that entire army for dozens of miles right to the gates of Samaria. Think logically. A battalion of blind men in the dark would never march in a line for miles behind a single man. They didn't stumble. They saw the road, the rising dust, and dodged the rocks. But the brain was under a profound cognitive blackout, a severe agnosia that prevented them from recognizing the enemy's face or knowing where they were stepping. That was exactly the weapon activated on Lot's porch, a pulse of energy so clean and focused that it hacked the central nervous system of the most predatory group in the ancient world. Sodom's ruthless and proud tormentors became, in a fraction of a second, chained prisoners inside their own deactivated minds. The rescue team broke the city's military force without spilling a single drop of blood, causing a neurological short circuit that modern science is still crawling to try and explain. Any survival manual, psychiatry textbook, or human biology guide agrees on a solid point. When an individual suddenly loses one of their primary senses, especially sight, the brain goes into immediate collapse. The amygdala, our mind's alarm center responsible for processing danger, goes off deafeningly. The primitive fight-or-flight instinct dominates the body, and since fighting an invisible enemy is impossible, a healthy organism's only logical response is absolute panic. The person screams, throws themselves on the ground, begs for help, or tries to run away in utter despair. That is exactly what should have happened on the street in front of Lot's house. When the neurological ray of sanvorim caused the spatial blackout in that crowd, The expected natural reaction would be a chaotic stampede. Hundreds of men trampling over each other to try and find their way back home, terrified by that unfathomable power that had neutralized them. But that's not what happened, and this is exactly where we reach the most macabre, grim, and revealing detail of the entire Genesis narrative. A single line of text, which usually goes completely unnoticed by most readers, but which is the definitive psychiatric report that seals the city's fate. The Bible recounts the mob's reaction with a coldness that gives you chills. And they wearied themselves to find the door. Stop for a second and absorb the gravity of this fact. They didn't run. They didn't cry for mercy. They didn't even feel fear. Even plunged into that severe cortical blindness, completely disoriented and groping the void, the instinct to commit evil was so animalistic, so deeply rooted and pathological, that it managed to override the basic survival instinct. Hatred bulletproofed their fear. Picture the claustrophobic scene unfolding in the dark of the street, under a disturbing silence broken only by heavy breathing, slurred curses, and the sound of bodies bumping into each other. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of men, eyes wide open but seeing nothing, scratching the rough masonry, peeling their nails on the wrong stones, yet refusing to leave. The obsession for territorial domination, the sick desire to break into that sanctuary and violate the guests, was infinitely stronger than their sanity. It is a classic clinical picture of mass psychopathy, like a terminal addict who, even with failing organs, keeps crawling on the floor in search of the next hit. The Sodom mob crawled along the walls, seeking to execute the attack to the absolute physical limit of their bodies. This flips the switch on our understanding of the nature of that event. The firing of the neurological weapon by the angels wasn't just an emergency defensive maneuver to shield Lot and his family. It was something much bigger. It was a diagnostic test of last resort, a true moral audit executed in the middle of the night. Pay close attention to the mechanics of justice here. If there had been an ounce of humanity, a trace of conscience, or a shred of fear left in those minds, the brutal shock of blindness would have made them retreat. Divine mercy, through that cerebral malfunction, offered a neon stop sign flashing in the mind of every single one of them. It was their chance to go home. However, by ignoring the roadblock and continuing to search for the doorknob like wild beasts in the dark, they signed their own death warrants. In modern criminology, experts deal with the grim concept of the irredeemable, that individual whose mental map has been so warped by violence and perversion that no therapy, rehabilitation, or punishment can bring them back to humanity. Sodom, as a society, had crossed that point of no return. The rot wasn't a mere behavioral deviation or a public safety crisis. Evil was woven into the city's DNA. The attack at the door wasn't just a punishment, but the ultimate, documented, and irrefutable proof that the minds of those people were gangrenous, with zero chance of a cure. The abyss had already devoured them from the inside. The night wore on, dense and heavy, and the sadistic delirium collected its biological toll. The Hebrew word used for wearied carries the meaning of an exhaustion that leads to physical collapse, a burnout down to the very last drop of energy. Slowly, one by one, those attackers fell heavily onto the sidewalk. They didn't fall to their knees in a sign of repentance. They collapsed because their muscles locked up, their knees gave out, and their bodies simply broke down from expending so much energy beating against stone walls. Dawn broke with the street lined with exhausted bodies, Filthy and bruised men, still moving their hands in the void in spasms of pure malice. The true terror of this story isn't in the fire or the brimstone. What really freezes our blood is the brutal realization that human beings, when they decide to fully surrender to darkness and silence their conscience, will keep trying to break down the doors of their own destruction even when plunged into absolute darkness. The attack at the door proved that patience has physical and spiritual limits. When the sun finally peeked over the horizon hours later, the city of Sodom was already dead. The fire that came down from the sky was just the final incineration of a social corpse that had already committed moral suicide in the middle of the night. The attack at Lot's door, dissected under the light of medicine and ancient Hebrew, destroys the childish view of a simple tale about angels and sinners. It is, in reality, the expert forensics report of a society in a terminal stage. The firing of the Sanvarim, the visual agnosia that caused a blackout in the crowd's brains, went far beyond a tactical barrier. It acted as an invisible dam erected in the exact millisecond between a man's surgical rescue and the relentless fury of a completely corrupted system. What is most frightening in the rubble of this narrative is not the mechanics of the supernatural attack or the neurological weapon that shut down an entire city's spatial perception. The true terror, the one that serves as a definitive warning for any generation, is the brutal realization about human stubbornness. When an individual lets themselves be dominated by the abyss, they lose even their survival instinct. They will keep scratching the masonry, tearing up their hands, and trying to break down the doors to their own destruction, even plunged into absolute darkness. The proof that patience has physical and spiritual limits lay right there, in the exhausted bodies fallen in the gutter. While many debate the temperature of the fire and the chemistry of the sulfur the next day, our documentary investigation brings a much heavier truth to light. When morning arrived and the clouds tore open, there was no one left to save. The city was already dead. Its inhabitants were walking corpses, buried in mental darkness long before the first spark hit the ground. The fire from the sky wasn't an act of war or judgment. It was just the sanitation of an open-air morgue.